Hello, Masculine Wilderness podcast listeners. Your producer Lauren here with a content warning. This episode discusses sexual assault, so please listen with that in mind and take good care of yourself.
Hi, everyone. This is Tom Perez. Welcome to the Masculine Wilderness podcast. I'm your host. I'm also the founder and CEO of Epic Project. This conversation that is ongoing now for over a year is about how we can help men just show up in the world in the healthiest version of themselves. And it's also I think an extension of my own story in this work as a man. I feel like I'm getting better and better at showing up in the world as a healthier man because of how this work has put me next to women like my guest today and many of the women all the women that we've had on this podcast in the last year. A conversation about masculinity must include women. This conversation today is an example of that. Penny Ronning is here with us, and she is, among other things, the head of the Yellowstone Anti-Trafficking Task Force in Montana, based in Montana. I'm going to do my best to behave myself today while we're having this conversation because she's also a graduate of Montana State University, Bobcat. This is the first Bobcat I've had. And most of you won't understand the rivalry, but I am a Grizzly from the University of Montana. So we're going to do our best to rein it in. But Penny, welcome. I've been looking forward to this conversation. Tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing now. And then I want to kind of go backwards and hear more of your origin story.
Thank you so much, Tom. Well, it is an honor to be the first Bobcat on your show. That's an honor.
Might be the last.
Yeah. Let's hope not. But it's such an honor to be on your show, and it's an honor to be here with Epic Project, and such an honor to be among the guests. And I shared with you that, I'm a huge fangirl of so many of the guests that you've had. These are some of the greatest leaders that we've got right now in fighting the most egregious crime that I think that is out there today. And that is the horrors of sex trafficking and human trafficking, labor trafficking, the degradation of humans and humanity. So it's an honor for me to be here, and I'm incredibly grateful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. What is the journey that got you to this work? You're a girl from, you said raised in South Dakota, North Dakota?
Born in South Dakota, raised in Montana.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how does a girl from the Big Sky state end up doing the things that you're doing? Yeah. And talk to us too also about what is the current scope of what you're doing there in Montana?
Yeah. Well, I'm the daughter of a trafficking survivor. So my mother was trafficked in rural South Dakota in the early 1940s, from the time she was 5 years old to 9 years old, by an older male family member. She would, and my aunt, who was 2 years older than my mom, he would rape them in the mornings, and then he would sell them to the neighboring farm boys to do whatever they wanted to do.
Wow.
This was, like I said, for 4 years in my mom's young childhood, 5 to 9 years old. And Tom, at that point in our history, we didn't have words like trauma-informed care, child sexual abuse, and we certainly didn't have words called human trafficking. We barely, if at all, had medical care for these types of crimes, especially when they happened to children. What my mom and too many other victims since had was, shh, don't say anything.
Yeah.
Boys will be boys. Shh. That's all my mom had. And my mom, through her life, when she began to grow into her female adult body, when she got her period, she would hemorrhage. The damage was so severe internally. My mom would hemorrhage. My mom survived because of blood transfusions. She lost multiple pregnancies. She was not able to carry me to term. So I was born premature with organs that were not fully developed, very, very sick child. These are, when we talk about child sexual violence, we don't often understand because we've not had the conversations about the scope of what happens to a little tiny body when an adult violates them and penetrates them forcefully. So we rarely have those kinds of direct conversations. My mom had an emergency hysterectomy at 42 to save her life. When the surgeon lifted her female organs out of her body, he said that they fell through his fingers like wet tissue. Her organs were literally rotting inside of her. So these are things that I grew up with, but these are things that were silenced in my family, like what you hear from so many other families, because of shame, because it was sexual and it was shame, and you didn't talk about it, and families didn't talk about it. So that really was the beginning of my journey.
Yeah, more, tragically, you're more than qualified to be in this work. It just blows my mind to think this was in the 40s, you said,
right?
And in a rural community,
right?
And like just those two things, in the 40s and in a rural community, that does not equate with what I think, and I think a lot of people think about when the idea of sex trafficking comes up.
Right.
It's that's the last place you would think that it happens. I'm just trying to just wrap my head around that, and also, like, I appreciate you. It's hard to hear just the graphic nature of it, but I think it's so important for people to understand that the physicality of the violence and the actual physical damage that is done. I mean, it's real, and I don't think we want to, that impulse, is, so persistent. Like, we don't want to talk about that,
right?
But man, we have to.
We do, and we're now at 2025. And the reality, Tom, I mean, the industry that you and I work in to fight this crime, and I'm sure you experience this too, medical personnel are still 2025, vastly undereducated on the damage that's done to child bodies with sexual violence. Where do we hold our trauma? We hold our trauma in our spines. We close our bodies in. We exactly. We round our shoulders. We hold our body, and we close ourselves in. And also, especially females, they're going to have UTIs, and those things always get misdiagnosed. Especially in young female bodies that have been sexually violated. Those types of medical care and medical concerns are often misdiagnosed and put off as something else. Same as behavior, they'll address trauma as a behavioral issue or a mental health issue, when really the systemic issue is trauma. And undealt with trauma and uncared for trauma, which is exactly what occurred to my mom. My mom ended up with spinal disease and had 7 different really explosive diseases all happen in her body at the same time. And my mom went from 5'9" to 5'4" in less than a year. Her hips had been badly damaged from when she was a child. Her spine was badly damaged. Her shoulders were damaged. Because we don't have those conversations of what is it when an adult-sized male body and penis is violently, and other instrumentation is violently on top of pushing those shoulders down, pushing those hips down to little child bodies. Soft tissue damage occurs, bone damage occurs, and these are things that rarely get addressed. And even in 2025, we're still not properly addressing them.
Yeah. My middle daughter and 2 of her 3 kids were here this morning, and stayed the night. And my granddaughter, she's 5. I just remember this. Like she was the first one up. I'm always the first one up, but then she came upstairs and just gave me a hug. And as you're mentioning that, it just chokes me up because I remember it was the highlight of my day. Just with my arm around her and feeling that 5-year-old body, just in a hug, she's just kind of leaning into me. And the what you described and what I experienced today is such a difference. And I don't know, as a man, when I hear, and I've heard others describe it. Our friend Jewel, we were talking about before we started, I've heard her share a lot of her story too. And I can comprehend it, mentally. But the emotional toll of that is hard. And I want to say, for people that are listening to, like, these conversations like what we're having right now are very hard. And if you feel like it's too much, then by all means hit pause, take a deep breath, go for a walk, come back to this when you're able, because it's just hard, but they have to happen.
We have to. We absolutely have to be having these conversations. And, Tom, we were talking before we started the podcast that I'm involved in legislation and use the podcast with Jewel Baraka, who we both call friend and admire so greatly.
Yeah.
I have sent her podcast from your show to our state senators because of a certain bill that we have that we're supporting, to help educate them, one, on statute of limitations, because in that podcast with Jewel, you actually asked Jewel the question, has she experienced justice in regard to the male family member? In her case, it was her father, who did the horrific things to her. Did she experience justice? And Jewel very forthrightly said the statute of limitations has prevented her from being able to do that. And that's one of the things we're addressing in Montana right now. My mom was the same. The statute of limitations prevented that from happening. But the reality of this conversation, Tom, is that most children who experience child sexual abuse or sex trafficking, violence of some kind sexually, they don't talk about or confront and oftentimes deal with what happened to them as a child until they are in their adult years.
Yeah.
We saw that from the things that we know from the horrors of within the Catholic Church, and the victims that have come out. They came out years later, and we see that Penn State years later, what happens to children. Often as those individuals become adults, then that's the first time they're really able to confront and speak about what happened to them as a child. So that's why we feel within our task force feels so strongly about laws that need to improve in regard to the statute of limitations. Those statute of limitations need to be there in order to protect the child, not the predator.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's the statute of limitations on things like this. It just, I'm not, and I won't cuss on my own podcast, but boy, it makes me want to, when I hear about justice denied because of a policy, kind of a decision. I want to come back to that because there's a bigger story there with the task force that you're doing. But I'm also curious, just like your background, you have a wonderful TED Talk that you gave. I couldn't find the date. How long ago?
It was just this past November.
I thought so,
yeah, it was, I would say, one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life, because it was the very first time I publicly in Montana told my mom's story and told our family story. I publicly do it when I'm in my task force role and when I'm training on human trafficking. But it was the very first time that I stood in front of a non-trafficking audience and shared my mom's story. And, I was able to do so also because my mom had died 2 years prior. And it was my mom who wanted me to share and talk about her story.
Wow.
With so many children who have been victims of sexual violence, not only do they not address it as an adult, but they often don't address it until the predator, the abuser, has died or in some way has become incapacitated to not threaten them anymore. And with this particular relative, he had died just shortly before my mom did.
Wow.
And so for all those years, my mom never got justice. But for her and her generation, she empowered me and wanted me to start talking. And same with my dad, wanted me to start telling our family story and start addressing that. We've done that as a family, but we had never done that publicly. So the TED Talk was the first opportunity that I had to do that. And it was incredibly difficult and emotional. And I will share with you that right before I walked on stage, I had forgotten all my words. I was crying so hard behind the stage, feeling my mom's presence. And I had forgotten all my words and was panicked that I would walk into the red circle and the words didn't come. And I walked into the red circle, saw my mom's little 4-year-old picture, and the words just came.
They came beautifully and painfully and powerfully. Yeah, it was a. I would have never known, I watched it a couple times actually, and had you not shared that with me, I would never know about that. It's beautiful and painful to listen to that. But I'm trying to connect the dots. I mean, you're an activist. You're I call you a policy wonk.
Very much so. Yes.
or geek. I don't know. You policy geek, maybe.
Yes, but, very much so.
And you actually ran for state representative at one time?
United States Congress, United States House of Representatives.
Got it. Mm-hmm. I mean, so you travel in those circles. You're an organizer and all of that, but you're also an artist.
Yeah.
Where does that come from? I think that's connected, but I don't know how. And I want to. Yeah.
I think growing up, I was a creative kid.
Okay.
And my mom was very much an artist. She was very, very creative also. My mom was a career federal employee. Her very first job was with the FBI. She worked directly for J. Edgar Hoover.
Oh my gosh.
And that was her very first job as an 18-year-old. My mom was recruited by the FBI when she was 17, but she couldn't be hired until she was 18. She was hired, and my mom's very first federal job was to report directly to J. Edgar Hoover.
The head of the FBI.
But my mom was also a very creative spirit. And growing up in Montana, in rural areas, but I was a kid of the 60s and 70s. And at that time growing up, women were still encouraged to follow career paths that were very traditional female. Mm-hmm. And that just wasn't me. I wanted to be a storyteller. I wanted to go into the arts. I wanted to go into filmmaking. And I remember sitting down my senior year of high school, and you and I were talking about this prior. I was sitting down with my school guidance counselor. This was my senior year of high school in Billings, Montana. And he asked me what I wanted to do for my college career plans, if I wanted to go to college. And I said, yes, the only thing I'd ever wanted to do was go to USC Film School. And he reached across the desk, patted my hand, and said, that's a nice dream, but let's talk about what you're going to do for a living. And I was devastated by that.
Wow.
And I shared that with my parents, and both of my parents were ag kids. Both my parents grew up on farms in rural South Dakota. Neither one had graduated from college. And so we talked about that. And my parents said, well, he evidently knows what he's talking about, and you should follow his advice. So I went to school at Montana State University originally, and so I enrolled in psychology, absolutely hated it, and almost flunked out. So we thought, well, it must be location. So I transferred to Arizona State University. Surely it must be location. So transferred to ASU and enrolled in speech and hearing science, and almost flunked out, but with a really nice tan. And the thing, though, is that while at ASU, I took a film class, and I loved it. It was a class that I got A's in. I loved it so much, but ended up coming back to Montana saying, I can't go back to school. It's just not the career path for me. So I actually became a flight attendant for 10 years. And that was awesome. Went all over the world, lived all over the world. And I'm so glad I did that. No regrets. But I will say that when I was in my 30s, I realized that the path I had chosen, if I was in my 50s and still doing that, there was going to be no other option for me to do something different in my life. And I made the decision to say, no, I'm going to go back to, my dad was actually almost killed in a car accident, and I wanted to go back to Montana anyway to be closer to my family. I was living in Tulsa, Oklahoma at the time. And so moved back to apply to film school at Montana State University, moved back to Montana. And my first year of college, I had a dog, and I couldn't find a place to live in Bozeman that would rent to someone who had a dog. So I drove almost every single day the first year I was in college and film school from Billings to Bozeman, Montana. It's about a 2.5 hour drive. And
Holy
you have
cow.
to go over a pass. I drove almost every single day.
Holy
and
cow.
Tom, I will share with you one of the best years of my life. I loved it. I absolutely loved it.
It's a beautiful drive.
It is a beautiful drive.
Yeah.
But I knew I was doing what was, what I felt so strongly inside. But it came down to storytelling. That's how I learn. I learn with patterns. I'm a visual learner. I'm a visual talker. And, you can see me on the podcast. Clearly, I use my hands when I talk. And I do. I'm very visual in that way. And it was really about storytelling. Film to me, but I also, I'm from Montana. You went to school in Montana. We have two huge legacy actors that come out of Montana with Gary Cooper and Myrna Loy. Mm-hmm. And I loved their films growing up. I loved the storytelling of television and movies. And that's how I saw and learned the best in regard to history. I learned through movies. I learned through film. I learned through storytelling. And that's why, I went back and got my film degree and then went on to get an MBA because I loved producing films. And that's really what I see now in our podcast and in the work we do in trafficking as well is, and I think what's so important about that is just what we do, you do in EPIC, we do in our task force. We all say it needs to be survivor-led. We need to be hearing the survivor stories. Again, it comes down to the learning of hearing the story.
Hey, Masculine Wilderness podcast listeners. This is Lauren, your producer. If you found value in our show, we've got an epic opportunity for you. Become an epic ally today and join our fight against human trafficking. Your monthly support not only keeps this podcast going, but also fuels our mission to protect the vulnerable and combat exploitation. For less than one coffee a week, you can make a real difference. Head on over to epicproject.org and choose an amount that works for you. Even $13 a month can change lives. By becoming an Epic ally, you're not just supporting the podcast, you're joining a movement. Stand with us. Let's make an impact together. Thank you.
What are some of the most annoying stories, and I'm talking here about myths. Like what are the dumb, annoying stories that continually are being told and in some way sold as a picture of what trafficking is? Like what have you seen? I have my own list, but I'd like to hear
Yeah. I don't know if they differ very much, because I think we all hear the same thing, because it kind of goes back to one of the things you had said early on about rural, that my mom was trafficked in rural South Dakota, and I live in a very rural state. And one of the things I emphasize to people is that trafficking is a crime against humanity. Wherever you have humans, you're going to have this kind of crime because it's a human crime. It's a crime that humans do to other humans. Yeah. It's not like people who live in a big city are these special breed of humans that are so radically different from humans that live in rural areas. Yeah. It's a human crime. It's a human on human crime. And, I am a Christian, so you go back to biblical times, Cain and Abel, human on human crime. Mm-hmm. And wherever you have humans, you're going to have many of the exact same kinds of crimes that humans do to other humans. Just in rural areas, sex, the talk about sex and sexual violence, I think gets covered up in so many ways, but especially in rural areas. We do hear the boys will be boys, that women have a very specific role. Females have a very specific role. Men and males have a different role. You think about our country in regard to agriculture and who we still typically picture as a farmer. When we say farmer, do you picture a man or do you picture a woman? Typically, most people are going to picture a male. They're going to think about that farmer in the coveralls and the blue jeans on a tractor. Right. But females are very present there, and females are very much a part of that farm work, but we just see them in a different capacity. Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that I see so much and hear so much in trafficking is going back to those, what some might consider traditional roles that movies have told us, that the church has told us, that other types of societal norms have told us, that men have certain needs and female bodies are there to perform those needs, that female needs are so much different. Female pain is so much different and less important than the biological needs of men. Yeah. There's that inequality of gender in what we feel within our bodies. But I think one of the things that has been most frustrating to me, because of what you talked about me being a policy geek, because of what we've been seeing in policy and what I know both of us have been addressing for years now, which is demand. Mm-hmm. But in regard to children, it drives me absolutely insane when I hear policymakers start and lead with, none of us want child pornography on the web, but this legislation is maybe not the way to go because there may be an adult, and they give any kind of excuse that there can be out there for why we need to protect adult business, why we need to protect big tech. There's always an excuse for why we need to protect adults.
And that always seems to be the deal breaker, right?
Yeah. I rarely hear any policymaker start with, we absolutely need to protect children. Let's lead with protecting children. And then if adults are harmed as a consequence, an unintended consequence, let's deal with that later. But let's first and foremost lead with policy that is protecting children. That's the stuff I think that drives me crazy the most.
Yeah. Montana has done some pretty courageous things legislatively that I've heard. And I think the most recent is the felony statute on sex buying, correct?
Yeah, that took me 8 years to get And 8 years
8 years.
we spent working on that. I lobbied and lobbied and lobbied for 8 years for
So
that to be addressed.
what is the essence of that law that you got passed? Is that
Yeah, so commercial sex buying is a felony on the first offense. That it is no longer just a hand slap, a slight misdemeanor and a hand slap. That it is a felony on the first offense now, and we've been able to show in Montana. But I'll back up for just a moment because this really goes with the addressing of demand and what you all do at EPIC as well, and to this law. So when we first started our task force in 2016, and we started the task force because I was a CASA advocate, a court-appointed special advocate for abused and neglected children, which I'm sure many of your listeners are very familiar with that program, which is the volunteer voice for children within the foster care system. The very first case that I had here in Billings was a 15-year-old girl whose mother had died and the father had abandoned her family when she was very young, I think when she was 2 weeks old. So she had no responsible adult. Sadly, the guardian that had been her guardian was her guardian because the mother had willed her over to a meth dealer, and the courts just let that happen.
wow.
But this young female was being trafficked out of a local fast food place. And for me, I had come back to Montana to help take care of my mom because she was ill with a spinal disease. So I had returned to help take care of her and became this CASA advocate, had this case. I'm in this community that raised me, and I'm watching this 15-year-old girl deal with the same stuff that my mom had to deal with back in the 1940s. And I thought, what have we not progressed as a humanity? And clearly we have not progressed as humans. And so it was that knowledge of how many children were being trafficked in my own community that really led to my family and me taking those steps of starting to address this. And so that's how our task force began 9 years ago. With that said, I will share with you that 9 years ago, when we first started to train on buyers, the anger, the pushback, the fight that we got, no one wanted that talked about. The society and community said no to that. They would not stand for that being discussed. We could not talk about buyers. They could handle us talking about traffickers and they could handle us talking about victims. But the anger that came, and it was predominantly from women, that anger came. We could not talk about that. And I was labeled a man hater and everything else when I tried to talk about buying. And as well as with law enforcement, the response I got from law enforcement, our very partners, FBI and our very partners in law enforcement, was men will always buy sex. I'm like, they're not buying sex. They're paying to rape people. That's the difference. That's the difference in trafficking.
But the language is so persistent. And this is where your work and my work and our, collectively, this is where we, I think, really intersected. And I was, last year in 24, we started this thing called the Demand Collaborative. And it was a long process. But when I saw your name on the list of people that are like, we're all in on this, I was really encouraged. I pulled up just a part of it. So part of this, the Demand Collaborative, really the only thing at this point we're asking of people is to sign on in agreement with a declaration. And I just want to read one part of it because I think it highlights what you just said. But reducing the demand for commercial sexual exploitation is generally acknowledged as necessary, yet it has been widely avoided, if not completely ignored, when it comes to actionable responses to the problem of all forms of commercial sexual exploitation, including sex trafficking. However, avoidance doesn't change the reality that the demand for sexual access to the bodies of vulnerable people by predominantly male buyers is the root cause of all forms of commercial sexual exploitation. furthermore, the Demand Collaborative understands that prostitution, the business system that profits from these kinds of exploitation, will never stop until the demand from male sex buyers that drives it is at the forefront of the conversation and action is taken. And I know at this point I'm preaching to you, the choir, on this.
But I'm like, you keep going. Keep going. Well, yeah, that's absolutely right.
I think what's so, I'd say it's sobering, is I hear you describing the pushback, like you just did, that happens in a place like Montana, in a place that's conservative and rural.
Yes.
And the same struggle exists in progressive urban settings as well.
Yes.
Yes. And it just shows how this issue in the world that we live today, it's so divided and polarized, on this issue, doesn't matter if you're a conservative or a progressive,
right.
There is resistance to the idea of holding men accountable. And I so appreciate what you're saying. They're not buying sex.
Right.
They're buying sexual access to vulnerable people. But there's so much deep systemic reluctance to have this conversation. I don't know if I've shared. I don't think I've shared it because we haven't shared it much publicly. But we have been invited into, and it's been a really neat collaborative project by some other members of the Demand Collaborative to address this issue very aggressively and very boldly in partnership with the Jacksonville Jaguars of the NFL. And
my heart is beating.
And it's because of survivors and some really amazing women leaders and the men who have stood alongside them that this thing is happening. But it's taken a long time to see something like that come out. But we want to shine the light on the men, and it's going to get bumpy.
Yeah. Well, and good.
Yeah.
Because it needs to be, and I'll take that a step further. It needs to be men talking to men.
Thank you.
It needs to be that. And the reason it needs to be that is because in the United States, and if we're talking domestic sex trafficking, if we focus on the United States, the equality standard has been the white male Christian heterosexual. That is the top of the tier when it comes to legal rights.
Yeah.
A white male Christian heterosexual is born with every single right under the law. Every other population group, all other population groups, still have not attained equality to the standard. And so we still fight for that. It should never be, and the lesser of the equality standard, fighting and being responsible to tell
change
the
things.
Standard,
yeah.
to tell the standard that, hey, what you're doing is wrong and you're hurting us. It needs to be men telling men, and it needs to be that responsibility of that conversation. It really does. Yeah. I hold women like my mom and Jewel and so many others that you've had on this podcast, Elizabeth Smart, and so many others in such extraordinary and high regard, as well as male victims, and men like yourself and Justin and JR, who I'm going to see JR the end of this month at the Grit conference.
Yeah.
So JR, who's on your board, just was with him at the national convening in the illicit massage industry in DC. So met JR there, but excited to continually have that interaction with folks from Epic Project. But men like yourselves who are leading this way and leading this conversation, and I'll add Detective Scaramucci into that as well. this is where, and Peter Qualiottine, oh my gosh, one of my biggest heroes.
Mm-hmm.
It's when you guys lead this conversation is when big change happens.
Yeah.
And when you lead this conversation, you empower my voice.
Yeah.
You empower other voices. You give credibility to Jewel. I wish that we had that naturally on our own, but we're still having to have our voices over. I'm just going to say a few names out there, the Dan Nashes and the Doug Gilmores, and we're still fighting to get our voices, up there.
Yeah. Well, I think it's, my experience in this work is I've noticed that there's the only way I can describe it is there's a certain frequency in a man's voice when he's talking to another man. It just carries, and I can't prove any of it scientifically, but I think just it's just that shared, masculine experience. Like and it's similar with women talking to women.
Yes.
But it's so frustrating when you see, especially survivors, and I have a lot of just beloved survivor friends. Like when I see how weary they become of saying all the things that I, as a man, can more easily and more persuasively say.
Yes.
I've had so many conversations over the years with survivors who say, look, I can say the same thing, they're talking to me. I could say the same thing that you, Tom, could say to a man, but if I say it, it falls on deaf ears.
Yeah.
But if you say it, exact same words, like there's a much better chance of it getting through. And I feel like that is the work that is unique for men. You don't have to be, and this is, for me, like, I think this is something that I bring and the guys of Epic bring to this work. We're just guys. We're not professionals. We're not counselors. We're not law enforcement. We're not policy geeks or anything like that. We're just guys. And I think embracing that is actually kind of the superpower of what we do.
Absolutely.
Talking to men. Yeah.
I couldn't agree with that more, Tom. And the way you said it was just beautiful. And I can attest to that. We brought Epic Project and Exodus Cry and Jewel to Montana to have a 2-day conference, so to speak. Wasn't your typical type conference. It was like a 2-day event. So we showed Buying Her last November, showed Buying Her, screened the film, had an extraordinary panel discussion with all of the folks that I just mentioned, had a full house, then did a workshop after. And the words that came from Jean McConnell, the words that came from Justin in leading the 2-day workshop, it was exactly that. It was men talking to men. And that's one of the things that I talk often about when I tell people how to train and teach people how to train on human trafficking, especially in medical communities or law enforcement. One of the things I say is, don't ask me to come for 30 minutes because I'm not going to do that anymore. It's just going to fall on deaf ears. You first and foremost need to understand that this is a human issue, and I first and foremost need to talk to the humans in the room before we even address their profession and how we teach them how to see or report human trafficking and deal with victims from their professional mindset. We first need to tap into their humanity.
You are the second
person. Need to do that.
Yeah, you're the second person today that has said that. Basically, in essence, I think it's humans. And so before we talk about even gender identity, before we talk about what is your profession, what is the area in which you work, like, this is a human. I love the way you say that refrain. It's a human issue. Even, I'd go so far as to say, even more than to say, like, I have kind of advocated for the idea that this is a men's issue. It's not a women's issue, but it's really like hearing your take on it. It's actually a human issue.
It's a human issue.
That's such a strong place to start the conversation. And that's not normal, though, is it?
No. We're not used.
Why is that?
Yeah, because I think as society, we have so compartmentalized each other.
Yeah.
I think that's why we have such a fight right now with pronouns, hearing people struggle with pronouns is we've so compartmentalized each other as human beings that we fail to see each other as part of the same exact species. We're humans.
Yeah, fully human.
Yeah, we're fully human.
Yeah.
And we want people to be in certain boxes versus, no, there are things that we all share.
Yeah.
And we need to find that commonality of what we all share, no matter what our gender is. We still are humans. I've still yet to hear of any alien species that has overtaken, human form.
Depends on who you talk to.
Yeah, exactly. Although I've thought that a couple of times, like, I don't think that person's actually human, but yeah.
I think that is one of the most helpful things I've heard in a long time. It's just like, let's begin this conversation. And that could apply to almost any like troublesome issue in our world today, right? If we could just begin it by saying, you're a human, I'm a human. We're made in the image of God, whether you believe in God or not, like, and that's the way, that's the way I believe and the way I was raised, but that's not a bad thing, even if you don't believe in it. So let's start the conversation there. And it feels like there's a lot more ways to continue the conversation rather than running into walls of, liberal, conservative, Republican, Democrat, man, woman, whatever, it's just seems so much more helpful. How many years have you been in this kind of doing this work?
I feel like 62. Yeah. I feel like 62. But technically, if you go back to when my family and my mom and when we first started to have these conversations with other folks more like privately and things like that, was actually when I was in full-time Christian ministry, and dealt with convicts and incarcerated individuals because I did prison ministry, but also with young kids that were is in battling suicide, ideation, and things like that. That's when the private conversation started. So for me, that was in the 80s and early 90s. But with the task force, where I said, okay, we've got to start coming up with community solutions for what is a community problem. We will never address this through law enforcement solutions. There's not enough money in the world to incarcerate every, offender out there.
Can't arrest our way out of it, can we?
Yeah, no, we absolutely can't. This is and I go back to using those words, it's a human problem. So it's a community problem. It's a societal problem. Yeah. It's the way we think about bodies and ownership. And we still haven't gotten beyond really what is slave, what is the rights that we have over other people's body autonomy. I've got this sign that you can probably see in back of me that body autonomy is a human right. And it always should be our human right over our own bodies to say, no, I won't work for you for no wage. No, I won't live in that dog cage. No, I won't, do what the things that you're requiring me to do. We should be able to have that type of legal protection and societal protection. For me, while I fight within policy to make sure that we've got legal protections, I first and foremost believe that this has to be a societal protection and a societal culture change that we make and that we do, that we think in our website and the signage that we use in our task force is that, and I go back because my own personal thing is about protecting children. Yeah. It's what I do most when I do trafficking work and policy work, but it's protect the child, not the predator. And that we have to have that mentality, that we stop saying to the children or the other vulnerable populations, don't you go to Uncle Tommy's house. Don't go to Uncle Tommy's house. We're protecting Uncle Tommy. Not you. I should say not you. Not you.
I am Uncle Tommy.
Yeah. Well, I'll come up with a different name. Don't you go to Uncle Fred's house. Don't you go to Uncle Fred's house.
Yeah.
And what's going to happen when that child goes to Uncle Fred's house? And what happens to, what Uncle Fred does, what he does to children, that child accepts all that responsibility because the child was given an instruction. We didn't give the instruction to Uncle Fred.
Right.
We didn't put the responsibility on Uncle Fred.
Nope.
So it really comes down to being a society change and a culture change. And that's where I think that it's first and foremost, those are the issues that we have to be addressing. And that's why, the NFL, the NFL conversation is so exciting, is taking it into those places, because those are the places where we see men with an enormous amount of money away from their families, and typically young men with an enormous amount of money very quickly. Yeah. I can relate to that in regard to the Bakken oil fields in Montana and North Dakota, where we saw trafficking just exponentially go off the charts in these two rural states, when we had 100,000 men come into very small, little teeny tiny rural communities that didn't have the law enforcement to be able to come up against the cartels that then came in, because they knew when you have an open door to criminal activity, because there's not enough law enforcement there to protect the populations, you have 100,000 men that have not been vetted, making very big money in these little teeny tiny communities. Well, the cartels came in and set up shop with, the strip clubs and the trafficking situations within the hotels, and it was off the charts. Absolutely off the charts.
Wild West 2.0 sounds like. Yeah.
Yes.
Wow. Yeah. All of what you said, I agree with 100%. The other side of it that I'm like, these days I'm trying to also speak to is, all of that is true about the men that want to exploit vulnerable people. But there's this, I feel like there's this hidden giant or maybe sleeping giant. And if you're from Helena, there's actually a formation. So if you ever go through there, there's this sleeping giant of male allies that if they could find their voice, and if other men that know what's going on would be willing to stand by them, help them learn, encourage them, give them confidence, so that they could then speak to their friends and to their sons and to their sons' friends. Like we're not without resources to change these outcomes. We just have to actually dig down and get to them, and really turn them loose. So,
right there with you, 100%. Right there with you. I am. Yeah. And have you seen the video that Peter Qualiotin has done with Truckers Against Trafficking?
I haven't seen that.
If you haven't, watch it. If you haven't, watch it. And it's about real men. And we've actually, Truckers Against Trafficking is one of our partner organizations, and we work with Peter as well. But we've incorporated that training into our training about real men conversations. And if you get the opportunity, it's 25-minute long video. Watch it. It's right up your alley, Tom. And it is men talking to men. And we've got to start addressing male violence, because it's not just male violence. We tend to think male violence on female. Male violence is also on male violence. The biggest perpetrators to men experiencing violence are other men.
Other men, yeah.
And
Peter planted those seeds in my mind. So we need to get him on. We need to get him on here and have that conversation with him. I'm glad that you guys have connected with him, because he's the I'm thinking of Lewis and Clark. We're talking Montana here, but he's the guy that stood on the hill and with the telescope and could say, here's where we're going and here's what we're up against, and like
he created a map. He absolutely
was a map maker. He was
Yeah.
the map maker. Yeah, that's so
I
good.
agree. When we brought Peter to Montana, and we had him speak in several different cities in Montana, it was then that we were able to break ground and start talking about buyers. Law enforcement would listen to us then. That's what changed. Is the community started saying, okay, but we needed, Peter Qualitin, what is he, like 8 feet tall? He's like this giant of a man. But listening to this giant of a man say, prostitution is not victimless. When he's standing up there and saying that, people start looking around going, wait, what?
Because he's speaking in that male frequency.
Yeah, exactly.
No, I've seen that. I've seen him do that. I've seen that very thing. So that's so good. Well, I have one last kind of final question. Kind of want to give you the final word here. But what is your best leadership advice? You've been leading. You are, for me personally, like you're the latest example in what is becoming a pantheon of leaders, all of whom are women that I have had the privilege of working alongside. Like you're the latest. It's pretty impressive. I'll share the list with you sometime. But
I would love that.
What is your best leadership advice to men?
Oh, that's not what I thought you were going to ask.
No, I know.
Oh, and I might need to have you ask me that in maybe some different language.
Yeah.
Are you talking about from me as a female to men,
I'm
or
saying,
just
standing
up? Okay.
Let me dial it in just a little bit. For men who care about this issue of exploitation, who are starting to see maybe there's something that I can do to help change these outcomes. So like guys that are maybe starting to get a little traction with this in their head and heart. As a leader, as an established long-term leader in this space, what's your best advice to those men from a leadership standpoint? Does that clarify it a little bit?
Yeah, I think so. And I'm not sure it would be dramatically different from what I would say to anyone. And that is, don't expect applause, expect pushback, but don't stop talking. Don't stop talking. Don't talk just when there's a crowd. Don't talk just when it's popular or trendy. You have to be courageous when it's quiet, when there's no one else around, when you're the only voice in the room. You have to be courageous and talk, and don't stop talking. And especially, I guess, for men in that way, because I think in some cases it is easier for females to talk about more sensitive type, emotional type issues than it may be for men in some cases. But the reality, and I think I even heard you say this, is men are feeling it. We have to give you the grace, and I have to come alongside you and empower you, and other men need to come alongside and empower you to say, it's okay to say it. We need for you to say it. It actually needs to go beyond me saying to you, it's okay for you to say it. I have to say, you damn well better say it. You need to be saying it and understanding and embracing your power in having that communication. The communication has to be circular for communication to actually be effective. So you need to be able to speak. Someone needs to be able to receive and bring, give feedback back. So there's that circular thing. I firmly believe that the more men lead in these conversations, the more men are going to join in the conversations, because I think you're giving permission to men to verbalize what they've been feeling. And that is imperative in in this work.
This mic I have is really expensive. Otherwise, I'd just drop it and we right now. So,
that's kind.
Penny Ronning, I am so grateful for your leadership and
right back at you
for your vision and not bad for a bobcat. Thank you.
Yeah. I love that. I love that, Tom. I do. Well, it's just such a joy to be with you here today. And that may sound like an unusual adjective to describe an emotion for such a heavy topic, but this topic has for too long been suppressed. So there is joy in being able to talk about and address something and actually being able to laugh at the same time. Boy, isn't that healing and wonderful?
Yep. Thanks so much.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you to everyone at Epic.